Well, good morning. I am Eric Toone. I'm the Deputy Director for Technology at ARPA-E, and I'm also the Director of the Electro program here at ARPA-E. As you know, this is our workshop day. This is meant to be a conversation between the agency and the scientific and technical community. I have with me today Jonathan Burbaum, who's one of our program directors at ARPA-E and who directs the Petrol Program. And what Jonathan and I would really like to do today is to engage you in the broad area of bioenergy. What we're especially interested in are areas of opportunity. So what Jonathan and I are going to do for a little bit is to tell you about what we're doing in the broad area of bioenergy at ARPA-E now. And what we'd like to do as we do that really is to sort of show by way of example what we imagine as an ARPA-E project and as an ARPA-E program. After we do that, what we would really like to do is to open up the floor to get questions and comments from the audience about areas that we should perhaps pay attention to, areas that we maybe have not already thought of. One thing that I will sort of put in as a ground rule before we get started is that we don't want to discuss specific technologies, either yours or ours, in the course of that conversation, but rather areas that might be ripe and appropriate for investment by ARPA-E. So again, the idea here is to have an informal conversation to help educate us. So I'm sure that I don't have to explain to anyone here what the real problem is in the area of biofuels very broadly, and that is they're very expensive. So this is a pretty interesting plot. This is a plot that represents along the x-axis the amount of oil that the United States uses from various sources, and then along the y-axis the cost of those sources. And you can see then that runs from exceptionally cheap crude in places like the Middle East, where they can get oil out of the ground and make money for as little as a couple of dollars a barrel, all the way through to corn-based ethanol, which you can see even at $100 a barrel is still almost not cost competitive without subsidy. So really this is an issue of cost and of scale. So what fundamentally is the problem? Well, fundamentally the problem is the plants that we have on this earth were designed to be plants, not to produce fuels. So all of you, I'm sure, have seen plots that look something like this that tells you what happens to solar radiation that falls on a plot of land that's being used to grow plants. And so, of course, half of it is not photosynthetically active radiation, and then there's a variety of subtractions that you take for various, what we would call inefficiencies, but obviously are there for a reason. And so we make it all the way down to the very end, and you can see that what we're left with is, in the best case scenario, the theoretical limit is on the order of 5 or 6% of the total photosynthetic radiation that falls on a plot of land can be converted into plant matter. And then, of course, that's a theoretical limit. If we take out inefficiencies for real-world sort of applications, if we realize that half of this biomass is stored below the ground, when all is said and done, what we end up with is, in the best case scenario, a few tenths of a percent of the total solar radiation that lands on the Earth can be converted and stored in the form of chemical bonds that we might be able to use for the production of a fuel. So what we'd really like to do is to find ways to circumvent those. In the spring of 2009, we made a number of investments broadly in the biofuels space, and here's a couple of examples of projects that we selected for support and why we supported them. One of the largest investments that we've made to date was a joint project between bioarchitecture labs, a Berkeley-based startup, and DuPont, looking at macroalgae as a source of feedstock for the production of liquid fuel. So macroalgae, giant kelp, a very interesting potential feedstock, no land, no water. The plant doesn't have to stand up, so no lignin. The entire plant grows above ground. All sound great. The problem, of course, is there's also no cellulose, right? And alginate is, in fact, the primary feedstock the primary storage polymer in macroalgae. And so the name of the game here is both to investigate the feasibility of macroalgae farming, harvest, transportation, as well as the development of a butynologen, or an organism capable of converting the non-glucose sugars that are found in alginate into fuel. Pretreatment, of course, remains a prohibitively expensive step for the conversion of cellulosic feedstocks into sugars that can be converted to fuels. We've also made investments in that space. The investment that we made in that first solicitation, a startup company in Massachusetts, Agravita, that's looking at conditionally activatable enzymes that are expressed directly in the plant itself. So the name of the game here is to express enzymes that would degrade lignocellulose. They really need to be directly in the cell wall. The challenge, of course, is growing a plant that contains enzymes designed to degrade a plant. And Agravita has been exploring the use of intene modification of these various lytic enzymes so that they can be expressed in silenced form and converted to active forms during pretreatment. Increasing the total biomass that's produced, tons per acre of dry biomass, is another area that we're interested in. And an investment that we made in that first solicitation is Ceres. And what we were specifically interested here was nitrogen utilization. So Ceres had developed a series of traits that increased nitrogen utilization, allowed higher biomass yields with less fertilizer addition. So ARPA-E supported the incorporation of those traits into various dedicated energy crops, and then also field trials in 4 different states in the United States. So another investment that we made in that first round. We've also looked at photosynthetic organisms, both algae and cyanobacteria. And so another project that we invested in that first solicitation was a joint project between Arizona State University, Bioenergy, a Minnesota-based startup company, and North Carolina State University. The name of the game here was to engineer cyanobacteria to produce in high titer and secrete fatty acids, free fatty acids, as potential feedstocks that could then be decarboxylated to linear hydrocarbons, either with or without the addition of hydrogen. That work was done at North Carolina State University. The real challenge in this particular situation is developing a means of growing these things where you're free of infection, right? Anytime you produce fatty acids, there's obviously lots and lots of things that love to live on fatty acids. So the question is, how does one deploy these things in a way where they're free of infection? That's where Bioenergy came in, a company that's developed a unique photobioreactor where the cells are physically entrained in a membrane. And those membranes can be arrayed in very high density orientations, in many instances designed to mimic leaves. So a novel photobioreactor, which is certainly an area that I think we would all agree is an area that's ripe for innovation. So we've also looked at photosynthetic organisms, again in that first round in PHO-01. Beyond that, we've sought to look at a number of innovative ways to convert solar radiation into energy-dense, infrastructure-compatible liquid fuels. Obviously, if we're going to produce fuels in a sort of durable, sustainable fashion, we're going to have to use solar photons as our ultimate input of energy, because, give or take, that's pretty much the only game in town. It's really the only energy input to the planet. To date, all of the fuels that we use for transportation, whether those are ancient fuels that we dig out of the ground, or whether those are modern fuels like biodiesel or corn-based ethanol, cellulosic ethanol, use photosynthesis to capture solar radiation, photosystem 1, photosystem 2, and then use the Calvin-Benson cycle to fix carbon, to use that energy to fix carbon, and to convert it into carbohydrates that can then be converted into a liquid fuel. So everything that we've done so far uses photosynthesis. Well, many of the inefficiencies that we discussed earlier result from photosynthesis, right? Photosynthesis was designed and evolved to grow plants, not to produce biofuels. So the question then was, are there approaches that we can use that would capture solar radiation, capture that solar energy, store it in chemical bonds in a fashion that could be used to provide motive force for transportation, but avoided the inefficiencies of photosynthesis? I'm a chemist by training, so one would like to imagine that there's a chemical solution to this problem. But of course, chemists are not very good at forming carbon-carbon bonds in high yield and high specificity. That's a very, very, very significant challenge. And to do things at scale and at cost is really still something that's beyond the realm of our capabilities. Nature, of course, is very good at forming carbon-carbon bonds. Nature's evolved all sorts of approaches to forming carbon-carbon bonds. And so the Electrofuels program then was designed to ask the question, are there non-photosynthetic organisms, so we can still use biology to form carbon-carbon bonds, that assimilate energy by some means other than photosynthesis? And the answer to this question, of course, is yes, there are, right? The diversity of microbial life on this planet is enormous and for the most part entirely unexplored. So we know, for instance, that there are 300,000 times more organisms in the deep ocean, right? The deep ocean, the part that has nothing in it, nothing in quotation marks. 300,000 times more organisms in the deep ocean than there are stars in the visible universe. And virtually none of those organisms have been even cultured, let alone explored for practical use in the production of things like liquid fuels. Many of those organisms exist in ecological niches where they don't have access to reduced carbon, so they can't live as heterotrophs, and don't have access to solar radiation, so they can't live as phototrophs or photosynthetic organisms. But rather, these organisms assimilate energy in a variety of different fashions, growing on hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, reduced metal ions, some organisms even that are capable of growth directly on electric current. I mentioned that all photosynthetic organisms fix carbon through the Calvin-Benson cycle. Calvin-Benson cycle, of course, incorporates rubisco, an enzyme that evolved at a time before oxygen was prevalent on the Earth, and so suffers from serious inhibition from oxygen. Nature, of course, has a number of other pathways for fixing carbon. The reverse tricarboxylic acid pathway, the Wood-Lungdahl pathway, hydroxypropionate, hydroxybutyrate pathway. Many of those processes, many of those cycles have never been investigated for practical application in the production of liquid fuels. So the name of the game in the Electrofuels program was created to explore these organisms, non-photosynthetic autotrophic organisms that might be used for the production of energy-dense, infrastructure-compatible liquid fuels. That program's about $45 million, 13 performers, and looking at a number of different approaches. So here's examples of a few of those approaches. We have several performers that are looking at organisms like Ralstonia that are capable of autotrophic growth on hydrogen. So representative of this family of projects is OPX Biotechnology, a small startup company in Colorado. Again, looking at engineered Ralstonia that are capable of autotrophic growth on hydrogen and CO2, producing free fatty acids that are then converted by Johnson Matthey into a liquid fuel. And they've been able to produce at least liters of fuel at this point. Another approach, actually an interesting one that we hadn't really considered as we were designing this program, but one that has emerged as potentially a viable approach, is the use of electrochemically generated formate as the source of both carbon and energy. So the name of the game here is to do electrochemical reduction of formate. There's certainly work to be done there, chemical catalysis to increase the efficiency of that process, and then using organisms that are capable of taking up formate and using formate both as a source of carbon and as a source of energy for the production of liquid fuels. An example shown here, Jim Lau at UCLA has developed a very interesting process where they're capable of a single reactor of electrochemically generating formate and then using that formate to produce butanol using an autotrophic organism. Perhaps the most interesting approaches from an imagination perspective are a group of organisms that are capable of direct autotrophic growth using electricity as an energy input. So this work comes out of a much larger community on microbial fuel cells, and it turns out that many of the organisms that are capable of producing electricity operating at a bioanode are also capable of operating at a biocathode and accepting electrons as an energy source. These organisms utilize these electrons at extraordinarily high efficiencies, at coulombic efficiencies approaching 100%, effectively as a defense mechanism, right? If I'm pumping reducing equivalents into you and you are an organism, you really need to do something with those reducing equivalents at very high efficiency. How well these processes are going to scale and at what cost is a very interesting question, of course, but again, a very promising approach developed through the Electrofuels program. So those are some examples of projects that we have supported in the first round and then also in Electrofuels. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Jonathan, who can tell you a little bit about the Petrol Program, another approach for producing liquid fuels.
Okay, thank you, Eric. So I'm Jonathan Burbaum. I'm Program Director for the Petrol Program here at ARPA-E, and Petro is an acronym. It stands for Plants Engineered to Replace Oil. And as Eric has introduced the ARPA-E portfolio so far, that was basically what ARPA-E looked like when I joined the agency a year and a half ago. A handful of sort of one-off projects that were innovative and interesting in particular areas of biofuel generation, and then sort of this blue ocean program that uses microbial life in a completely new and innovative way. So when Eric lured me to ARPA-E, it was with the opportunity to really come up with a program like Electrofuels that had the potential for changing the world. So the challenge then, as we're sort of putting out to you, is where do you get those ideas, those programs from? How do they sort of generate? What's the thought process that goes behind a program as opposed to a project idea at ARPA-E? So I thought I would just give you a sort of a high-level map of what alternative fuels space looks like. What we show on this slide is, on the left-hand part is sort of conventional biofuels, feedstocks that are then converted into a liquid fuel that can be used in transportation. Now, the feedstocks are variable. The conversion techniques can be anything from biological to chemical, but there's basically a step that you capture the energy and then you convert it into something that you can use. On the right-hand side of the slide is what I would call artificial photosynthesis, and this is sort of the general topic of efforts like Nate Lewis's at Caltech for the fuels from sunlight direct photosynthetic conversion, and I think that's a promising approach. But the thing is that plants have had about 2 billion years of process optimization to go through the process of actually capturing energy and converting it, and they're still not very good at it. Sort of in the middle, we have algae, which have the capability of generating alternative fuels directly, either from natural oils or from fuel molecules that are sort of engineered in. And here the problem is perhaps a little bit more subtle, in the sense that it's really an economic one, where algae, what you need to use algae is you need to have a low-cost but highly efficient light capture and carbon capture apparatus to grow them in order to be able to get maximal productivity out of them. So this is basically the landscape that I saw coming into ARPA-E. And as far as just for schematic, Electrofuels really, in my mind, fell between algae, which combines capture and synthesis into one organism, between that and sort of direct capture, where you're just doing chemistry all on one surface. So the other white space that was here was really on the other side, between algae and feedstock. So if you could get plants to directly produce fuel molecules in planta, then you would have a system that would be competitive and provide a new path through to alternative fuels. And I sort of brought up a tobacco plant just because it's something. This is a 4-week-old tobacco plant, and I start looking at plants differently now. I sort of look at leaves now and I say, that's a pretty low-cost, efficient way of doing carbon capture into cyanobacteria algae, which were the precursors of chloroplasts. So there's a wide variety of plants and wide variety of areas that you could imagine that doing, but it's a sort of a different way of looking at what we see every day. So Petro, the concept behind the program was to really take areas of photosynthesis optimization and metabolic engineering and combine those two operations in a novel way to develop a dedicated biofuel crop where you were capturing more energy, more carbon, and then you were diverting it into higher energy molecules than sugars that could potentially be used as liquid fuels. And you sort of needed this in a way that was going to be heritable, so you could actually do some breeding with that. And we needed to set some stretch goals here. So in order to do a comparison, we chose the process of going from corn agriculture all the way through to creating ethanol from the corn that's grown. And that works out to be about 80 gigajoules per hectare per year. So we set a goal of twice that. And if you remember the first slide that Eric showed with the price of biofuels relative to petroleum-based fuels, you see that a factor of 2 might bring corn or a crop in North America to the level of productivity of sugarcane in Brazil. So that's the sort of thing that gets us to basically a cost of less than $3 per gallon of gasoline equivalent. So that was the goal that we set up for Petro. We've just now initiated the projects, and we've got basically 4 broad areas. I should point out that all of these performers are going to be in the showcase. So if there are things that you're interested in this area, please visit their booths and talk to them. They're a great group of people, a great group of performers. But we've sort of divided it into oilseed, where we're really looking at camelina as a promising crop in that area. C4 grasses, things like switchgrass, sugarcane, corn are all C4 grasses. Trees, basically loblolly pine, which I will get into on the next slide, and then other things that were there, primarily tobacco and giant cane, as well as guayule, which is a desert plant. But these are the sorts of projects that we have funded under Petro. It's a $36 million 3-year program at this point. So one project, as I mentioned, was the ability to use pine trees as a biofuel source to produce fuel molecules. And this was particularly interesting because loblolly pine is already grown for paper production on large areas of the U.S. And before there was petroleum, there was a process for isolating basically fuel molecules, turpentine, from growing trees by just tapping them. And we already know that you can take loblolly pine, and there's a whole infrastructure involved in being able to process this on an industrial scale. So it would be a matter of taking what is now the paper industry and turning it into a fuel industry that produces paper as a byproduct. So that's by simply increasing the yield of these terpene molecules in the trees. So that's what that project is all about, and it's a collaboration between 4 groups here. Another example of this is camelina. As I mentioned, we've got 3 different groups working on camelina. One of them is Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, and in their proposal, they're looking to improve both light capture and carbon capture, as well as upgrade the molecules that are made to get both higher yield and better quality seed oils from the process. Camelina turns out to be relatively easy to engineer. So this process, there's a lot of changes, but they're all pointing in the direction of an improved dedicated biofuel crop. So the final example that I'm going to give is one of sorghum. Sorghum is part of the C4 grasses. And it's currently cultivated in North America already. It's sweet sorghum, and it makes sorghum molasses. That's the jar on the upper right here. So the concept here that Chromatin is pursuing is to engineer sweet sorghum through a proprietary technology that they have to divert the energy that would otherwise be going to sugar production and to make fuel molecules directly in place of the sugar. So the idea here is you would have something that you could harvest and through a cane mill basically generate, instead of sugar water coming out, you'd be able to generate fuel directly from that process. So those are sort of the examples of the types of projects that fall within Petro. It's like I said, it's just started out. We just held our kickoff meeting in January, and we're really excited to see how these projects pan out. But I wanted to give you a flavor for how an ARPA-E program is conceived of and executed. So with that, I think we move to questions. So, Eric, how do you want to handle it?
Yeah, so we have a couple of microphones here. We're also monitoring a Twitter feed, and as I mentioned, what we would really like to do is to get impact from you, the experts in the field, this community, about areas that perhaps might be ripe for innovation, things that we should be looking at as we go forward. So I'd turn it over to you.
My question is about the potential use for algae for biofuels. You've talked about sorghum and switchgrass and terpenes from pine trees, but I didn't see that there was any funding or any effort going on for algae, at least in your presentation for Petrol.
So we have certainly funded photosynthetic organisms, cyanobacteria at Arizona State. We've also looked at algae. We have not looked at algae as a source of biomass. We are working with NREL to understand the sort of big knobs on cost that can be turned and how one goes about making these approaches cost competitive. It seems to us at this point that the most significant need in that space is in the broad area of photobioreactors. And so that's a space that I think that you know, as I mentioned with BioC, we've already made an investment. I think it's entirely possible that we'll make additional investments in that space going forward.
Thank you.
Hi there, Maureen McCann, Purdue University. So I'm interested in the Petrol Program that you've developed, but it seems to me that, for example, the example you gave of sweet sorghum, the fuel is essentially a co-product, and actually that would leave you with a large amount of residual biomass. And so I'd like to suggest to you that another area that would be ripe for ARPA-E is to consider methods of energy densification of biomass that could be applied on farm, so that in fact you weren't taking on large energy costs in transporting the biomass, but concentrating it in a form that it could be delivered to the biorefinery gates.
I think that's a good suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, and you know, so I would say that the best method I can think of for densifying is to do exactly what Jonathan's doing, and to try and drive the average oxidation state of a carbon atom, you know, in the feedstock down and remove oxygen that way. But absolutely, point very well taken.
Hi, Kev Katzen, CEO of Protero. Just following up on the algae question. So I'm a little confused. There was an announcement last Thursday about, I guess the acronym is ASAP, the Algal Sustainability Production. I don't remember exact terms, but is that something coming out of ARPA-E, or is that a DOE program? I read different reports, and could you comment a little bit?
That's a DOE program coming out of the Office of Biomass Programs, I believe. That's not an ARPA-E announcement.
Okay, thanks.
Alon Hochbaum, University of California at Irvine. I'm wondering about your use of terminology when you refer to the Electrofuels program as a blue sky or blue ocean project, whereas recent work has seemed to suggest that it's certainly very interesting and feasible, as opposed to projects like the sorghum one, where you're trying to get a plant which normally produces high concentrations of sugar to produce, say, oils or fatty acids, which might be just as unnatural. So does this have any implication for the future funding of, say, electrofuels projects, or is it considered a real cornerstone of the ARPA-E initiative in this direction?
You want to take that?
I think, I'm not sure that I'd think of it as a cornerstone. I think what Jonathan was referring to is, remember where ARPA-E sits in the sort of TRL space, right? I mean, so OMB buckets all research into 5 pails: basic research, applied research, development, demonstration, deployment. For the most part, ARPA-E is not going to fund science. caveats, right? We might have to dot some I's or cross some T's, but what we're really interested in is that applied research and development piece. What we're really interested in is the first demonstration of a technology based on fairly sound scientific principles. When Jonathan referred to it as sort of a blue sky kind of project, I think what he meant was electrofuels is probably about as early as we would be willing to make investments. That was that was an investment in a pretty early stage technology. And so I think that's really what Jonathan was driving at there. Now I would say that in retrospect, it's really worked out quite well, and some of those technologies are really emerging as potentially viable, potentially practical. But I think that the point of the comment was that was pretty early for us.
Yeah, I mean, what I meant to say was that it was an area that hadn't really been on the stage at all. It was really not something that had been considered prior to ARPA-E funding. It was trying to find an alternative path to a new path to alternative fuels.
So, thanks.
Yeah.
Point taken.
Eric and John, thank you. That's a strong platform. My question is similar to the question from this morning, is will you open up the Bioenergy program or a larger open solicitation to allow renewable chemicals and bio-advanced materials to participate, so that you now have the program agnostic to feedstock and agnostic to conversion technology, but not quite agnostic to product. And so unintentionally, you're not allowing high-value chemicals to participate, which could address reducing the 4 quad, BTU use our country consumes of energy and industrial manufacturing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as Arun presented this morning, there's this notion of a learning curve where the cost is higher per value early in the life, and I think that alternative paths to renewable chemicals lies on that path. In order to get to something that's cheap enough to burn, you have to start somewhere to get to the scale that can keep it economically viable. So I think your point is well taken.
Thank you.
Dave Erickson from Cornell University. I have a question. Not all of the programs, but a lot of them seem to revolve around, sort of a partnership between a startup and a university and so forth. Now, is that sort of how you envision most of the programs being, or is there a particular reason for that? Like, is that where you think ARPA-E fits in nicely, or that kind of stage, or is there some?
No, I think that ARPA-E is interested in supporting, the kinds of innovation that we want to support across the entire space, and it's absolutely true that a lot of the money that we've deployed so far has gone to universities and to startup companies. In fact, close to 2/3 of it has. But we've also made investments at large companies as well, at DuPont, as I mentioned, and as I also mentioned, that's basically the largest investment that we've made to date. We've made investments at General Motors. I think that a significant part of the reason that the money has gone to where it's gone is a natural consequence of the TRL space that we're going to play in, right? So, if one imagines that basic science is primarily the realm of the universities and national labs and things like that, and those first demonstrations of technology are going to happen at spin-out startup companies, I think it's sort of a natural evolution that you would imagine a lot of the money going to those places. But certainly, we are by no means in any deliberate way trying to steer money in those directions, and I think there's enough examples of other investments that we've made, that make that clear. Certainly, if you're going to make investments at places like DuPont and at General Motors, we have to be very clear that we're not displacing private dollars from the innovation space, and so we need to be investing in technologies that would not have a source of support other than ARPA-E. But with those caveats, no intent to direct money in any particular direction.
Yeah, so I guess as we think about putting together future proposals and so forth, it's more important to think about being in that transition space rather than finding the right startup company to partner with, I guess is what.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that if you're going to come to us from a large company, it has to be clear that what you're doing is developing technology that is simply too early stage, too risky to warrant development from the company itself. It's very important to us that we're not displacing private dollars, right?
Thank you very much.
My name's Steve Brumley. I'm from the University of North Texas in Denton. Just recently moved there from Australia. For the past decade, I've been working on engineering sugarcane as a biofactory for the production of industrial chemicals. And I've done projects with DuPont, Metabolics, and Procter & Gamble on this avenue. What this has led to is our development of a genome-scale model for C4 grasses. And so I'm wondering if ARPA-E is interested in funding the sort of infrastructure for developing a really good genome-scale model so we can go in and do the in silico science, which will help us do the predictive work for developing these metabolic engineering pathways in plants. Because this works great in bacteria, but plants are many orders of magnitude more complicated than bacteria. So these genome-scale models need a lot of work for us to develop and need a lot of investment to perfect them and get them operational.
Yeah, I mean, we can't address specific questions of funding, but I think that what you're describing is of potential interest to some of our performers. I think you should try to reach out to them in the showcase and see sort of where it fits into the fabric.
Yeah, I think that Jonathan's exactly right. To the extent that those tools were part of a technology development, I think that we would potentially be interested in them, right? But large-scale scientific exercises to develop large-scale genetic models, things like that are probably more in the purview of the Office of Science, which of course has made very significant investments in genomics, very significant investment in genomics.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mike Aller. I'm Executive Director of the Space Coast Energy Consortium in Florida. And my question is regarding waste energy and specifically, wastewater treatment. I hear a lot about, bioenergy and kind of building from, through the agricultural pathway, which is very important. And obviously, algae is a part of a pathway for wastewater treatment. But especially in places like Florida, we have a lot of algae not only in our wastewater streams, but also just out in our surface water. And so how could there be opportunities for research? I haven't heard a lot about opportunities for research in that pathway where we're doing it for not only for wastewater treatment, but also surface water treatment. Thank you.
So we have looked at those spaces from a variety of different contexts. There's certainly an energy-water nexus, so we're interested in water generally. There has been a significant effort, mostly funded by the Office of Science, in biopower using wastewater streams, microbial fuel cells, and the like. I guess that I would say that we have not yet seen an ARPA-E opportunity. What we sort of refer to it as is the ARPA-E. Where's the sort of piece where for $40 million plus or minus dollars in 3 years that ARPA-E could get in and sort of change the conversation, move the needle to send things on a different curve that may or may not pan out. So I would say that we are interested broadly in the sorts of things that you're talking about. I would say we have not yet found what would be the ARPA-E play in that space, but certainly very happy to talk to you and hear what you might have to add.
Hi, my name is Ed Carapezza. I'm with General Atomics and also Carnegie Mellon University. A general question or suggestion. For years and years, I worked at DARPA before coming to General Atomics, and I'm just now getting familiar with ARPA-E today. One thing that struck me, and it's a suggestion for consideration if you don't have this mechanism in place, is at DARPA we always had focused programs. The program manager was interested in something, he brought workshops together, went around the country, talked to people, formulated the program, sold it to the director of DARPA, and the program was initiated. There was another pathway that in my many years at DARPA was actually produced the most disruptive technologies. And that is, we had open BAAs where people could submit in very, very general broad areas, such as maybe this biofuels area, where you really got the outliers. You got the people who had technology that potentially was going to be disruptive, but it didn't fit into the niche of the solicitation that you were putting out. So my suggestion, if you don't have that mechanism, is to think about it, because there's a real history of uncovering wonderful disruptive technologies by having that sort of mechanism. Thank you.
Could not agree more. And of course, our first solicitation, was that sort of a very broad, wide open solicitation. As you know, we have an RFI on the street right now looking for input. It's entirely possible that we will run another open solicitation. I would add to that another mechanism for funding at DARPA always has been, that there was an opportunity program directors had sort of, walking around money, as it were, that they could make small seedling investments in interesting technologies that they discovered in the course of their travels. And I would say that we're in the process of putting a mechanism in place to allow us to do those sorts of things as well. So I think it's a great suggestion. Could not agree with you more.
Hi. To piggyback on that question, how does ARPA-E work with the agencies that do the basic science? For instance, DARPA. They've got an alternative fuel program going on now. It's about ready to wrap up. Does ARPA-E pick it up to kick it over the finish line?
Sure. I think that if you look at the way, especially that the Department of Energy is structured, I mentioned those OMB buckets. Almost everything that the Office of Science does fits into basic research. Most of what the applied programs do fits into the later scale, the demonstration deployment, certainly driving established technologies down their learning curves. I think that what ARPA-E is really working hard to do is to position itself between those two agencies, an opportunity to take the sort of scientific discoveries that come from the Office of Science, see if there's a technology that can be constructed on them, and then ones that look like they might have legs to pass them off to the applied programs for scaling and those sorts of activities later. One has to remember that we're still a relatively small agency. Our budget for 2012 is $275 million, right? Office of Science about $4 billion, applied programs about $3 billion. So, we very much sort of see ourselves as the Marines to the rest of the department's army, right? I mean, we win battles, we don't win wars. So we're there to try and identify places where we can get in, often build on recently established scientific principles, demonstrated technology, and then pass it off to others, both within the Department of Energy and outside the Department of Energy, including the Department of Defense, with whom we work very closely, for scaling and deployment.
Okay, thanks.
My name is Paul DeGive, and I run a firm that works with early-stage clean energy companies to help commercialize and accelerate them. Could you say something about ARPA-E's interest with respect to algae?
I'm sorry, ARPA-E's
interest with respect to algae and algae production.
Yeah, so again, I think that we're very interested in photosynthetic organisms. My concerns with photosynthetic organisms, I would say, surround deployment at scale in a cost-feasible fashion. And again, I would be happy to be convinced otherwise, but I think that our thinking at this point is that the biggest barrier to that deployment at scale and at cost is in the space of photobioreactors, right? And approaches that allow us to deploy algae over the areas that are required, using water and fertilizer in a way that it's sustainable and can produce fuel at cost. So I think that in the photosynthetic organism space, the biggest need that we have identified is in photobioreactors. Again, I would be happy to hear otherwise, but that seems to us to be the biggest issue.
In my view, I think that going through algae is one of many paths to alternative fuels. And all of the paths that are out there have issues, including algae. And the technologies that address shortcomings of each of those paths, I think, should be considered by the agency.
Okay. Well, if there's no more questions, this works out well. We're just about through our time right now. Lunch is the next activity, and I would remind people that Secretary Chu will be speaking at lunch for the technology development winner. So thanks very much for your input. We'd be happy to have more on a one-on-one basis throughout this next couple of days. Thanks very much for coming.